Speaker calls the House to order. The House calls upon the President to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I'm the king.
God save the king.
I'm the king today. Okay. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Yes, I did.
I was simply thinking.
Should we also? I also started it.
I was just considering.
This House stands resolved. Topic of debate. Resolved, monarchy is the best form of government. Each man in favor, raising his hand, saying yay.
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 I'm yay for now.
Is this in a Catholic society?
I'm yay leaning.
Or is this in like America? Or is this in
Counterpoint. I already made a name of you.
The Declaration.
Each man against, raise his hand, saying nay.
The Declaration of Independence is
like a half?
Me.
Each man abstaining, raise his hand, saying lay.
Lay.
Got him.
Okay, guys, I'd like to make sure I support.
Isaac, stop talking.
Sorry. I support monarchy.
Those in favor are 4. Those against are 5. Those abstaining are 1.
No, I'm just praying for 4.
I support monarchy. I don't support heredity.
This House recognizes His Majesty for announcements.
Okay, well first, I need a secretary of printing. Is anybody willing to print everything for me? Maybe for free from the government. You could be a secretary of printing?
I could.
Weekly printing job?
Do I have to be secretary of distributing posters?
No.
Okay, then yes, I can.
If you can
secretary.
print the stuff,
This is becoming way too
if you can print, I just need somebody to do it for me.
Aren't you sitting on the
You're
bureaucrat?
right, 1984.
Is anybody willing to be the secretary of distribution?
Aren't you sitting on the
I can
bureaucracy side?
Okay, so you, Jack, from henceforth, you will be known as the secretary of printing. You shall print the copies and distribute them to Tom. Tom will distribute them to the remainder of campus.
Can that be added to my title?
Yes, it will be added to your title. I decree it to be so.
Program.
By the power invested in me by me.
No.
All right.
Daniel.
He doesn't
But
care.
that's-
Daniel will send them to you, and you will forward
All
or
right.
give them to me.
And I'll approve stuff.
You gotta add all
Then-
that.
Daniel.
Yeah. Remember to have all your comedy skits prepared for Saturday. I do actually have a question for this guy.
People are really
Silicon
taking
Valley.
4 hours.
Do we have to be original in our comedy skits, or can we reference an old comedy skits that were substantial? Okay. And can we have a double act? If say we were doing something like Who's on First? If we were doing something like Who's
Am I
on
the
First?
secretary of
If
Can we have a double act?
His Majesty, Mr. Dodge, means by double act, you can do it with someone else, as in like it can count as both of yours. So like if you join with Isaac, you can do 10 minutes. No, but you can involve the audience in your individual act.
Can I be
All
the
right.
secretary of sitting there and looking pretty?
Well, you know, as king, I'm going to beat
Mr.
them.
Secretary of Homeland Security.
All right, thank you.
Lincoln knows.
I will sit
I hear
down.
the musicians.
Actually, Anthony is secretary.
Debating for the government as Prime Minister is the Honorable Gentleman from Louisiana. And leading the opposition from Silicon Valley is the gentleman from Silicon Valley.
Oh wait.
The member of government is the Honorable Gentleman from Chicago.
Yeah, Chicago.
And the member of opposition is the Honorable Gentleman from Canada. The House now calls upon His Majesty to lead this chamber in the Ave Regina Coeli.
Why don't we start?
The ideal form of government is socialism.
Ave Regina Coeli, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve radix, salve porta, ex
quam mundo lux est orta, gaude Virgo gloriosa, super omnes speciosa, vale o vale decora, ergo nobis Christum exora.
All may be seated. This House recognizes the Honorable Prime Minister to deliver a speech not to exceed 7 minutes.
So we have to ask, what do we mean when we say that monarchy is the best form of government? Well, first, we do not mean that monarchy in every single particular time, place, or circumstance was great or did not fail, or that it ought to be implemented in every single bit. What we are saying is that monarchy, from an objective, universal viewpoint, is the best form of government based on 4 main factors, such as its metaphysical superiority, its natural superiority, its practical superiority, and its theological superiority. To give an example, every Catholic must acknowledge that consecrated religious life is the best form of vocation. But just because not everyone ought to be consecrated religious does not mean that it is in any way less superior to that of other vocations. Likewise, monarchy may not always be the best in particular circumstances, but this does not take away from the objectivity of monarchy's superiority. Like I said, in order to prove that monarchy is objectively the best, we need to show it in 4 ways: its metaphysical superiority, its natural superiority, its practical superiority, and its theological superiority. Beginning with metaphysics, we see that everything that is created with a final cause in mind. The purpose of government is, if we are to take the view of the whole of philosophy, is the upholding of the common good. Now, the ends of the common good are best achieved under the rule of one. And this is for many reasons, but the main one being that unity is a transcendental, like truth, goodness, and beauty. Many of the doctors of the church, such as St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Robert Bellarmine, Francisco Suarez, St. Athanasius, St. Jerome, St. Justin Martyr, St. John Chrysostom, and St. Cyprian, affirm this reality, as well as non-Catholics, such as Philo, Plato, Aristotle, Seneca, Plutarch, Homer, and others. Now, since unity is a transcendental light, goodness, truth, and beauty, all mankind, whether they know it or not, strives towards unity, either through distorted means or well-ordered means. Because mankind naturally strives towards the transcendentals, and because, like goodness, truth, and beauty, we ought to instill and obtain the transcendentals in all things, natural and supernatural. Therefore, we must apply this to our government. And if in the natural and supernatural realm, this is best achieved under the rule of one, then monarchy, which is good ruled by one from a metaphysical perspective, is the best form of government. Regarding human nature, we must recognize that government, like all human institutions, are based on the primary institution of the family, and stems from the family unit either directly or indirectly, as affirmed by Pope Leo XIII. And we see that governments, being human institutions, are based on a twofold reality, that of the natural equality of man and the natural hierarchy. By studying different institutions, we see that the more temporal the institution is, the more likely it is to produce good fruit if it reflects the temporal institutions of the family. Examples of this is the family-based economy in the Middle Ages, as well as farming and landowning in the noble and peasant families. Now, government is the highest temporal institution with the purpose of protecting and nourishing families. Therefore, it ought to reflect the structure of the family. Now, let's look at dynastic monarchy. For as all members of the family are equal under the governing of the father, so too are all members of the country equal under the guidance of the king. And this familial structure aids the country and the monarch better than any other structure. An analogy is, let's say there is a businessman who owns a company, and he has 2 alternative options. To give his company to his son, who has been raised in the art of managing the store since a young age, or a group of shareholders who will elect another shareholder who may or may not be as experienced. From natural reasoning alone, we see that the first option is the best, and the same applies to monarchy. We also see other factors of the family that relate to monarchy superiority, such as lifelong rule and stability. And we see, of course, many other things as well. But basically, to try and shorten this, we see that from a natural perspective, that monarchy is the best form of government. And to sum up that rule for life part, a good father is a father who rules for life. A good pope, as Pope Francis says, is a pope who rules for life. Therefore, a good ruler is one that rules for life. Monarchy is the most practical, actually, for we see that it is the most efficient, having the majority of power and authority and the entirety of the government's legitimacy bound in one person allows for a more effective government, not having to constantly delay or debate on every matter, but allowing for one man to step in and make the decision, just as the father has the ability to step in and make a final decision. In a monarchy, the monarchy has a lower probability of accepting bribes, lowering, and we see this specifically because the monarch is already born into power, raised from a young age in the art of governing, unlike elected officials who by the very act of election have to get the support of others. And again, this is much longer, but I'm trying to shorten it. Finally, we prove monarchy's theological superiority. From the deposit of faith, we see that God, being the supreme and maximum goodness, only works in a supreme and maximum way. Everything he does is absolutely perfect and of the highest good. The incarnation and death of our Lord was not merely the best way to save mankind in our particular circumstance, but was the greatest method of bringing us to beatitude, as stated by St. Thomas Aquinas, Blessed Duns Scotus, and many others. Christ took on human nature, not because of the circumstances of our salvation, but because we are the microcosm of the universe, and are beloved by God in a way that even the angels are not. The garden was the most perfect dwelling place of humanity, and the church is the most perfect society, structured in the best way possible. If all I have said is true, that divine revelation shows that God will always act in the best, most possible way, then this logic ought to be affirmed. If God only enacts his will in the greatest way possible, and if our Lord chose to take on a title of a monarch, establishing himself as Christ the King, and if Christ chose, as St. Robert Bellarmine argues, to structure his church as a monarchy, then it ought to be held that monarchy is the best form of government. If any other form of government were truly better than monarchy, then Christ would have established his divine order as such. Monarchy better reflects that of the divine order than any other, as St. Thomas Aquinas states. Just as the founding of a city or kingdom may suitably be learned from the way in which the world was created, so too the way to govern may be learned from the divine government of the world. Moving on, we actually see, of course, I am not defending pure monarchy, but a mixed form, as any reasonable person would. St. Robert Bellarmine's description of the best form, must I finish? Oh. Either way, we also see in many of the doctors of the church, the Semitic...
Point of order, the rules say the time stops when the timer goes off. Is that
My apologies. Thank you.
I thank the Honorable Prime Minister and call upon the Leader of Opposition to deliver a speech not to exceed 7 minutes.
In this speech, I'll first bring up some contentions of my own, and then respond to my opponent's 4 points. Contention 1, weak plaids. Again, weak plaids. Costello, classical doctors Costello and Muria in 1897 said, quote, Aristotle taught that monarchy was only suitable for populations incapable of governing themselves, and believed that power ought to be shared within populations generally made up of equals, end quote. Contention 2, more corruptible. Again, more corruptible. Same source. He also felt that it was easier to corrupt an individual than the multitude. Contention 3, hereditary harm. Again, hereditary harm. Aristotle further criticized monarchies for tending to become hereditary, which to him carried the undue risk of conferring power on someone incapable of bringing ruin to the nation, end quote. We also see Marsilius of Padua, under the influence of Aristotle, advocated rule by the majority and argued that a ruler who is elected is greatly to be preferred to rulers who are hereditary. Now let's address the case. My first resolutional analysis point, actually this is more of an observation. You can write this observation point down as burden equal or better. Again, burden equal or better. The government, when saying monarchy is the best form of government, must prove that it is not equal to the other forms of government, that when mixed with a bunch of other little potpourris of oligarchy and democracy and aristocracy, then it's great. No, they have to prove that monarchy, not monarchy and democracy and aristocracy together, no, monarchy is the best form of government. Not that it's equal, that it's better. All you have to do to either abstain or to vote opposition at the end of today's debate round is think that, no, I'm not totally sure. I must suspend judgment. There are 4 things we have to do when we look at the affirmative case. First, are we being informed of all the right facts? Second, is there any misinformation? Third, are there any fallacies in the argumentation? And fourth, is the analysis complete? I argue my opponent's analysis is not complete to the political system, therefore we must suspend judgment in good conscience. Resolutional analysis point 1, criteria. Again, criteria. What is the criteria for deciding what is the best government? My opponent said metaphysics, nature, practical, theological. I agree with all of them. Which is the best? What if my opponents prove metaphysical, but then fail in the other 2 or 3? Does that mean it's not the best? But isn't metaphysical more important than practical? Also, what about longevity, size, influence, uniqueness, power? All those have not been considered by the government side. Resolutional analysis point 2. What is a king? What is a king? It's very funny when you look at definitions for kingship. Oxford Language says that the male ruler of the independent state. And then when you look at what is a ruler, it says what is a monarch, a sovereign, it says a supreme ruler, especially a monarch. And then when you look at a monarch, it says a sovereign head of state, especially a king, queen, or emperor. And then finally, when you get to ruler, it stops being circular and says, according to Oxford Language, that a person exercising government or dominion. So again, I'd like to ask my opponents, what is a dominion? Does that mean that the king possesses all of the land inside of his reign or inside of his nation? We don't know. Until we know, we cannot, in good conscience, vote for the government side. We also have to look at what is it that qualifies as a king? Is a president a king? Well, he seems to have a lot of powers, like a king. According to Adams, reminds us that the presidency, so Adams reminds Washington that the presidency is, quote, by its legal authority defined by the Constitution, has no equal in the world excepting those only which are held by crowned heads, end quote. And that it would be hard for the new nation to uphold its dignity and authority in the world without at least some splendor and majesty. Also, we see that some monarchs are elected, like the Polish king or the Pope. And that when an elected monarch dies, according to Prakosh, or advocates, an electoral college would then select a new monarch. So that seems to not be hereditary. Must monarchs be hereditary? If they're not hereditary, why is the President of the United States not a monarch? He has a bunch of power. In fact, this is according to Virginia law, quote, after the Constitution was ratified, foreigners and even monarchs from other nations believed the President was a king under the title of President. The President had many other powers monarchs had. He was Commander-in-Chief, had the power to make treaties and judicial appointments, and could grant pardons. The U.S. Electoral College recalled the system used to elect the Polish and papal monarchies. Even Samuel Johnson, the writer of the first English dictionary ever, published in 1755, included president as a synonym for monarch. What is king? Now let's look at my opponent's contentions. First, he said that it's metaphysical unity. I would agree that while you can have metaphysical unity, that doesn't need a monarch. You can have a unity of a nation. According to Thomas Aquinas, he says that, quote, I answer that, as Augustine says, quoting Tully, a nation is a body of men united together by consent to the law and a community of welfare. You don't need a king for that. You can have an aristocracy or democracy to do that. Next, he talked about the nature of a family, to which I'll have at least 3 responses. First is that in a family, you can't marry your daughter. In a kingdom, you can't. If you're a king, you can't marry your daughter. It's not a good analogy. Also, a father loses his jurisdiction over his kids at a certain point, at a certain age. Does that happen in a monarchy? No. It's a bad analogy. Third, once a father gets old, he doesn't take care of his children, the nation, as my opponents would like to use the analogy. No, they take care of them. You take care of your father, you feed him, you remind him what day it is because he's getting senile. He can't fight anymore for his nation. He is weak. My opponents would say he should keep a cow. The analogy of patris familiaris goes against my opponents. And also, you can have this idea of fathers of the nations without a monarchy. That's what the senators actually in ancient Rome were called. And there were about 300 of them in the Republic period. There were 600 of them in the mid-Republic, 900 of them at Julius Caesar, and then Augustus Caesar brought them back down to 600. Next, my opponent talked about theological. How theologically it's best, and so if Jesus is king, then we also must have kings. However, according to holyredeemedmervyn.org, quote, heaven is run as a monarchy with God being absolute ruler, not even taking counsel, because he's already operating,
15
loving,
seconds.
and powerful. The angels and people of heaven are part of the monarch's hierarchy with greater or lesser, with defined rules, living for blah, blah, blah. The point is, this is not analogical at all. He doesn't take counsel. A king is supposed to take counsel. And he couldn't take counsel, and he already knows it. Thank you for your time.
I thank the Leader of Opposition, and now call upon the Prime Minister to interrogate the Leader of Opposition for a period not to exceed 3 minutes.
Okay. Do you believe Marsilius of Padua to be a reliable source of Orthodox teaching?
I know nothing about him.
Are we debating what a king is?
And in order to debate something, one must know what it is.
Or this is a debate about the nature of kingship or whether over its superiority?
Whether it, and its essence contained in its nature, is superior. So yes, it is about the nature of kingship, correct.
Do families usually have one or many fathers?
Depends on what part of the country they're in.
Could you restate, was it Redeemed Merlin or?
Oh yes, it's a priest, but he writes on .org somewhere. He's a monarchist, but my point wasn't that he was right on monarchy, but rather that saying that, oh well, you have to, because Christ is king, you have to have a king. Well, no, that's not true, because he doesn't operate like an earthly king.
So to clarify, you would deny that there's any analogy between God's kingship and temporal kingship?
I would say there is an analogy, however, it's not to the strength that we should form decisions off of it. It's more like a poem. Like if there were a good poem about monarchy, that's great, and it's helpful. It's definitely an egg in your basket, but it's not the whole dozen.
Why do you think God, in divine revelation, would choose to use the analogy of a king rather than that of another form of government?
Good question. I suppose because his control is absolute. However, in the earth, when we try to have absolute monarchy, it doesn't turn out too well.
Is our side advocating for absolute monarchy?
You're absolutely advocating for monarchy. Your partner said mixed monarchy, but that's not the same. In fact, I would go back to the question 105 from Thomas Aquinas, where he says, the best form of polity being partly kingdom, so part, since there is one that had in all, partly aristocracy, insofar as the number of persons are set in authority, partly democracy, i.e., and then he says something about how the people decide who those are. So I would say part. If you have a mango, a third orange, and a third apple,
Okay.
it's not an apple. It's part orange, part mango, part apple. It's not. It's
You
mixed.
cite St. Thomas, taking him as authority.
Yeah. No, I'm not taking him as authority, but looking at his argument.
What form of government did St. Thomas explicitly say?
He said that the worst is tyranny, and also the best is the worst is a king that's the tyrant. The best is a king that's not the tyrant.
Do you believe in the principle of the corruption of the best is the worst?
15 seconds.
The best is the worst. Yes, that's his argument. Yes.
Okay, so therefore monarchy would be
No,
the
no,
best. if it
no. You
was-
misrepresent him totally. He argues that we should have parts of the system, like the Israelites, where they had the elders, advisors,
Time.
etc. He does not argue for a monarchy.
I thank the opposition,
Oh.
and now call upon the government to interrogate the opposition for a period of 3 minutes.
How is a monarchy different from an aristocracy?
Are the monarchy from different from an aristocracy? The legitimacy of the government, what makes it its essence, is that it has a monarch with the legitimacy flowing through it. Just to clarify, a monarch does not have to have absolute power to be a monarch. If that were the case, St. Louis IX would not be a true monarch.
But if he had less power than one of his
I would argue so that the legitimacy flows through it. It flows through it. For example, the reason why the English monarchy is always up for debate including amongst conservatives and liberals, is that the entirety of the English government does depend on its legitimacy, even if it has.
Well, we all know that England hasn't had a monarch since for about 200 or 300 years. But moving on from that, so you would say that the government and how to determine if it's best or not is only contingent on legitimacy.
I would argue the flowing through whoever it flows through. For example, the Roman Republic did have a mixed form of government, but the legitimacy did flow through that of the Senate, making it an aristocracy. And for example, the modern American government, we call it a democracy not because it's not mixed, but because, according to our founding documents, philosophers, the legitimacy flows through that of the people as a whole. And so I argue the same applies for a monarchy. If you got rid of St. Louis IX, you get rid of the monarchy as a whole.
All right, and is your contention that Aquinas is for monarchy?
I would argue he is
As the
for
best form of
a mix.
government.
I would argue there are two reasons. I would argue from a purely metaphysical perspective, he, like St. Robert Bellarmine, who quotes him, and also with the other philosophers I mentioned, that metaphysically speaking, yes, monarchy is superior. However, he would also argue, again, not contradicting our statements, that a mixed form of monarchy is best. And because
And why are you
only
saying yes? You might have interrupted.
Yes.
All right. Why are you saying that it's called a mixed form of monarchy instead of a mixed form of aristocracy?
I actually have St. Robert Bellarmine right here.
But why is it that you're giving the title of part democracy, part aristocracy, part monarchy?
Because the church has done this. Specifically, St. Robert Bellarmine is a controversy. He called it mixed monarchy.
So you're appealing to authority. Now, can you give me the reason St. Robert Bellarmine says that?
St. Robert Bellarmine? Okay, sure. He first argues in his first chapter of De Controversies that
Why he calls it a mixed monarchy?
Why he calls it a mixed monarchy?
Instead of a mixed aristocracy.
A mixed aristocracy? We reckon monarchy.
France had thousands of years.
Because monarchy, in his argument, chapter before, pure monarchy is the best from a purely metaphysical perspective form of government. So therefore, a mixed form of government ought to have the monarch be superior, and therefore we call it a monarchy. The monarch has a superior power, superior authority, and the legitimacy
in everything
through it. In this specific case, yeah, really? In monarchy.
And can you give me an example from? Would you say the medieval times generally had what you would call mixed monarchy?
Mixed monarchy? Yes, traditional monarchies, it's called also known as feudal monarchy, was in fact a mixed form of government based on social norms and mores.
And in a feudal monarchy, you would argue that
the legitimacy flowed through the monarch.
And you would also argue that knights and freemen, they swore pain up to their lords.
I would argue they swore loyalty to their lords, who swore loyalty to the king, and they would also
I thank the members of government and opposition, and now call upon the member of government.
Lest we be confused about the position of the great common and angelic doctor of the church, allow me and forgive me if I go at length to read from his justification and clear position that monarchy is the best form of government. I will start with his, what was disputed, but which I think is one of the strengths of the monarchist position is that theologically, in terms of God himself, governs by monarchy, and we'll get into also his church governs by monarchy. So in question 103 of the Prima Pars of the Summa Theologiae, in the corpus of Article 3, St. Thomas, answering the question whether the world is governed by one, responds thus, quote, "We must of necessity say that the world is governed by one. For since the end of the government of the world is that which is essentially good, which is the greatest good, the government of the world must be the best kind of government." Now I want to get this right. Now the best government is the government by one. The reason of this is that government is nothing but the directing of things governed to the end, which consists in some good. But unity belongs to the idea of goodness, as Boethius proves in De Consolatione Philosophiae. From this, that as all things desire good, so do they desire unity, without which they would cease to exist. For a thing so far exists as it is one, whence we observe that things resist division as far as they can. The dissolution of a thing arises from defect therein. I just want to be prudent with. Therefore, the intention of a ruler over a multitude is unity or peace. Now, the proper cause of unity is one. For it is clear that several cannot be the cause of unity or concord, except so far as they are united. I'll skip ahead. Therefore, a multitude is better governed by one than by several. From this it follows that the government of the world, being the best form of government, must be one. This is expressed by the philosopher Aristotle. Things refuse to be ill-governed, and multiplicity of authorities is a bad thing. Therefore, there should be one ruler. Okay.
There is.
Let me cite not just St. Thomas, but one of his most faithful sons, who alerted me to this quote of our angelic doctor, Father Reginald Gary de Lagrange, the great sacred monster of Thomism of the 20th century. This is from his article, work on royal government, translated by Matthew K. Minard. Consequently, a government, a regimen, is good to the degree that it succeeds at promoting the common good of the multitude by maintaining unity and harmony in a society according to the natural subordination of ends. Skip ahead for the sake of time. Now, in order to tend toward a unique end, above all when it is superior and difficult to realize in the midst of many causes of division, there must be unity in direction and consistency. Skipping ahead, quote, consequently, says St. Thomas in chapter 3 of De Regno ad Regem Sapri, monarchy is the best of governments, the most unified, the most durable. Well, monarchy is the best government, close quote back to Father Gary, the most unified, the most durable, that which is the strongest for promoting the common good. Okay. To finish off our quote mind, I'll go to that De Regno, book 1, chapter 2. I will skip ahead. Thus, the more efficacious government is in keeping the unity of peace, the more useful it will be. For we call that more useful, which leads directly to the end. Skipping ahead. Therefore, the rule of one man is more useful than the rule of many. And he gives multiple arguments for this. I'll try to summarize as time is coming to a close. When one is pulling a ship, it is better for one to be governed by an unum, a one. For instance, several men could not pull a ship in one direction unless joined together in some fashion, and it is best to be joined in one fashion. We see this in nature. He cites the king bee. The king bee, or I guess we would say the queen bee nowadays. I don't know, maybe we got woke or something. So yes, you can read the rest of that article on your own. It very clearly states that, while St. Thomas might say, practically some elements of other regimes would make for a better regime, he clearly says that monarchy is the best of governments. The rule of one is the best of governments. So he, quite frankly, he answers, is monarchy the best government? Yes. And so you can take that on his authority. I know that's a weak argument, I guess, but he also gives reasons, and the church is a monarchy.
I thank the member of government and call upon the member of opposition to give a speech not to exceed 5 minutes.
So my first point is pragmatism. I would like to start with the point which is the most evident. Monarchy is simply not pragmatic. As we know, politics is primarily governed by the virtue of prudence, which is time and circumstance. As Aristotle routinely notes throughout the Politics, it is not about the best regime, it's about the best possible regime. Monarchy is simply not possible. Let's not allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. Let's not allow the ideal to be the enemy of the possible. Monarchy is not possible in our current age. Banning abortion is possible. Banning gay marriage is possible.
Yes.
Subpoint 1. Utopian politics. The Politics by Aristotle is clearly deviated from another book, The Republic by Plato. Plato ignores the particular for the general. This is his problem. This results in a vulgarization and degradation of his political philosophy. We can clearly see this in Book 5, where Plato argues for gender ideology. He says, quote, the only difference between them is that the males are stronger and that the females are weaker, referring to physical strength. Whereas, as we know from the group chat, Aristotle is way more base than that. And this is because Aristotle has an eye for the particular. My argument is that monarchy ignores the particular for the general. The monarchists ignore our current circumstance and time because they live in the world of forms. The same thing is true of communism. There's a very clear danger in thinking about ideas which have no practical application. Undermining our regime. Monarchy is directly subversive to our current regime. Aristotle argues that civic loyalty consists in loyalty to our regime. Instituting a monarchy would necessarily indicate regime change. The problem with regime change is that those who have power do not give it up if they desire power. This will cause war. Regime change causes war. Point 3, nepotism. Our current republic is human advancement. No longer are we ruled by a parasitic class of so-called aristocrats, men who have never engaged in toil, never strived for greatness, men who know nothing other than exploitation. We want to implement this class to oppress us once again?
No.
While I'm being a little bit hyperbolic, the overarching point still remains. A selection process based on merit is obviously better than one based off of hereditary rule, which is the monarchical system. For, don't they say it's like the family? For it would be fallacious to say that because the father is virtuous and competent, that his son must be. Aristotle says, in kingship based on family, one should regard as a cause of destruction. Point 4, rarity. Aristotle argues that a true monarch is actually very rare. Kingship no longer arises today, talking about ancient Greece. If monarchs do arise, they tend to be tyrannies. This is because kingship is a voluntary sort of rule with authority over relatively great matters. But today, there are many persons who are similar, with none of them so outstanding as to match the extent of the claim to merit. If in Aristotle's day, where the biggest city was a city of 200,000 Athens, how much more today are we affected by this problem? When we live in a country of 350 million Americans, let's ask ourselves this. Can the monarchists even point out to one man who's worthy of ruling? Can they point out one man whose competence, loyalty, and virtue signifies that he holds supreme power over 350 million Americans?
I thank the member of opposition. The House will now be opened, first to questions and then to comments. Questions from the floor.
I have a question for Emmanuel, the gentleman from Canada. So you talked about the multitude, and Aristotle says that when the city is too large, order is impossible, right? You referred to 300 million, who is worthy, whatnot. So then do you agree with Aristotle that we should limit times when couples can come together in conjugal union, so that therefore they can be more orderly? So therefore the city can be orderly?
Well, I do think people should be prudent in the way in which they have kids. They should not just always have kids. I think people should be prudent. They should say, do I have the resources to have kids or do I not? And they should base their decisions on that.
Okay,
so if our current country is not, if that's not possible, then, if it's sort of, so that's my perspective.
Don't you think that Aristotle would also say that it would be impossible, in fact, to be orderly, even in your precious democracy? Wouldn't it be impossible to be orderly with that 300 million number still being there?
Yeah. Well, doesn't that just prove that our system's the best, even though we have a population of 300 million?
No.
We can't obtain rule. We have some sort of order. We have sovereignty.
Do we have order? Do you think we have order?
Yes. Wait. Absolutely. Okay. Canada has order.
Yeah.
Emmanuel's nationality has nothing to do with the debate.
All right, thank you. Emmanuel. So, You talked about how regime change causes war, right?
True.
However, in Book 5 of the Politics by Aristotle, Aristotle calls out war as a positive thing to instill change good for the citizens. So, would you say that it is possible for war to bring about this regime change that can actually bring prosperity and perhaps goodness to its citizens? Don't you think it's, instead of warning against regime change, perhaps we should warn about a government that limits virtue?
Yeah, I agree to some extent, but I would just fall back on, the idea that, because in my notes I have this concept that, how is a monarchy going to be established? It's not going to be established if there were to be one by Catholics. It would be by the current plutocrats, the current elite. That's just my, okay. Maybe that group of people would have their hand in the government. So I think that because those plutocrats are sort of, as Dr. Plato calls them, neo-pagans, the kind of government that they would establish would not be virtue. So I would just fall back on that, yeah. I think that, yeah, I agree to some extent, if there was a possibility of establishing like a based monarchy, I would support that.
So what you're looking for is the homogeneity of the small city-state. That's what you're looking for, which is what Aristotle is advocating for. Because you can't have that in a large state such as the 300 million that you're talking about.
Well, I'm not. What's your point?
My point is you're going to have to find some way of splitting up the 300 million regardless of what regime you pick.
Yeah, I'm just saying that it would not be pragmatic. I don't really have a positive argument. I'm just criticizing these guys.
Okay.
I'm not proposing any government.
All right, I have a
Fair enough.
question. I have a question for Ian.
Wait.
For the gentleman from Louisiana. Okay. So this is kind of a three-part question, but so why should a person inherit a supreme authority based on birth, not virtue, prudence, or justice? What happens? Yeah, okay. Why should a person inherit supreme authority based on birth, not virtue, prudence, or justice? What happens if their heir is incompetent, immoral, or cruel? Are citizens morally bound to obey them? And how does hereditary succession, by that logic, protect the common good?
All right. Okay. I'll try to go through it. If I can ask clarifying questions in case. Okay.
Yeah.
So your first part of your question. Could you say that just one more time very quickly?
Yeah.
Very first part.
Yeah.
I want to make sure I break it down.
Yeah. Sorry. Why should a person inherit supreme authority based on birth and not virtue, prudence, or justice?
Sure. First, I would actually argue, and I'm going to try and point a little more at the practicality argument to try and bring it back into our defense as well, is when we talk about the probability of corruption specifically. What incentivizes corruption? We talked about this like the occasions of sin incentivize sin. We can talk about how putting yourself in more virtuous circumstances affects your virtue. We see that specifically, and I mentioned this with the economy, that, and this will go into my next answer, why should we base it off this? Well, first, I'd argue that when it comes to the virtue, and specifically of instilling virtue, that's best done in the family. None of us here would argue that the state itself should instill virtue in every single aspect. We don't believe in public schooling. Most of us don't for a reason. But specifically, it is the parents that instill virtue. Now, parents are not perfect. Children are not perfect. Children can, in fact, disobey their parents. However, I'd argue there is a higher probability of instilling virtue, of instilling skill, not just virtue, because you can have good moral monarchs who are also not skilled, but there's a higher probability of having a monarch who is raised from the age of reason in the arts of governing, which includes politics, economy, war, religion, etc. You have a higher probability of him being better at it, as well as being more virtue and learning virtue from his father and from his father also.
How is this not?
Then you would say someone who merely got into politics in high school now has a natural incentive to take bribes to lower his moral standing, including what he says publicly for the sake of.
But how is this not chance? This is
not chance?
This is just luck. We're just blindly
Not
hoping that the child.
Wait, not entirely.
Parents are good.
Not entirely. I mean, we usually say
I have a probability I'll win my poker game.
we usually say not entirely. We use the same arguments to prove, specifically in more modern Catholic schools of thought, that the probability that the Catholic Church is the true religion is of higher probability. It's not always based on luck. A lot of it is also based on reason, because we would also say, I would argue, and I think you can see that is more reasonable to say
But
that a
king's
son.
not divine revelation.
The king's not. I never argued king's divine
Right.
revelation. I'm arguing.
I have greater evidence that the Catholic Church is true because of God rather than king. And so I think the problem.
I'd argue. Well, Archbishop Sheehan would agree with me specifically, writing his fundamental theology and apologetics specifically. He's the forerunner of that. So I'd argue probability can be used in a way that's not mere chance, but showing. I'd argue you can also see just from natural reason alone, having a child raised in a proper family setting, in the virtue and art of a thing, has a better chance of being better at that thing than someone who merely gets
But
into
this
it
is
later.
a Pascalian wager. To me, it's just luck.
Is Pascal's wager?
Yeah, it's just a Pascalian wager on
I'd argue Pascal's wager could still nonetheless prove that goodness. I'm trying to bring it up.
It doesn't prove that.
And the second part specifically, could the people overthrow a monarch?
It doesn't prove that it's the best, however.
The best, however, specifically?
It's just more probability.
I'd argue
probability that
then it's a bet. Then I would
Christ is
argue.
like a good guy.
Then compared
It's
to
the best.
democracy and aristocracy, it is
I
best
think
based on
it's greater
probability
probability
and.
of the virtuous
Well, I'd
person.
argue not only based with metaphysics, based with natural, but also again, we could also even then, by that logic, based purely on probability, that monarchy is also better than democracy and aristocracy, based on probability alone. But we also prove from other reasons it's better.
What?
I didn't get to answer the second part. Forgive me.
You're just a limited
No.
way, actually.
I was gonna go into
Question I
evil,
have
sorry.
for the opposition is, earlier they mentioned how Christ instituted the church, not in the form of democracy, but in the form of a monarchy. I guess, like, what would you have to say with that, but especially specifically also, like, when, if it is in fact a monarchy, right, in the way that they're talking about it, then how would you, deal with the question of, well, you just said like, oh, monarchy can't handle 300 million people, but the church has 1 billion people. So, I guess, what would you say about the church being a monarchy?
Yeah, I think the state is, you have, what's the term? You have like supremacy of the law, right? In a sense, that reflects God, who is supremacy of the eternal law. Well, in our current regime, the current regime has supremacy over, I guess, the written law, the human law. And that's a big principle of Western civilization, right? So in that way, I do think that American society does reflect, God does reflect the divine, in that sense.
What I'm asking is, how is the church a democracy? Or rather, how is the church not a monarchy? Not a democracy. How is the church not a monarchy?
I would add that the pontiff is elected. My opponents have contended, as part of their argument for why monarchy is best, the hereditary aspect. In order for them to accept that the church is a monarchy, they must give up the hereditary argument. Unless they do, the church is not on their side.
Okay.
Alright. I have two things. Okay. One is against my own side. And I'm just wondering why you need to support hereditary monarchy as well. Because I think in movies like Gladiator, for example, show that there are two things that can go terribly wrong with hereditary monarchy. There's the one that is kids raised in power usually get corrupted in some way or form or shape. And the other is that family behavior is cyclic. So that so theoretically, if anything were to go wrong with one of the monarchs, and he were to raise his family wrong, that would continue on for generations. So I'd argue, what's your method of combating this?
Sure. So, I will concede specifically, and I did have this in my speech, but I could not get to it, that monarchies of their nature do not have to be dynastic. The reason I argue that monarchies, temporal monarchies, are best as dynastic, I said as best dynastic, are particularly because they represent they are a temporally based reality. And temporal systems, institutions, when they reflect a family, do better. I mentioned this specifically with economy. There's also a case of warfare even. There's a reason why when modern military superseded medieval militaries, the first people they hired was the nobility because they were the best at it. The reason why I'd argue that some institutions, including the Catholic Church, including universities specifically, are electoral and are best electoral is actually because they do in a way represent abstract universal truths and more spiritual rather than temporal. We argue, and this is true, Aristotle was technically...
I would encourage answers to be brief.
Sorry, my bad. So I'd argue that monarchies of their nature did not have to be dynastic, but temporal monarchies specifically are better as dynastic, and that even electoral monarchies, although I'm not personally a fan of them in a non-spiritual sense, are still better than any other form of government nonetheless.
And my question for the gentleman of Canada. Okay, so I heard you arguing with deposition of governments, or I mean like the overthrow of the current government or something to make room for a monarchy. You know, that's kind of, that I'm a bit confused on that, because the principle of American democracy, the Declaration of Independence, actually in its first lines advocates that for when a government rules and it does not protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, a lot of things we can obviously see that the American government does not, the people are allowed to depose it and institute a new one.
So when I'm saying regime change, I'm actually referring to a very technical term. A regime is the constitution, like I said in my speech, is the constitution of a nation. It's not constitution in the sense of a piece of paper, it's a constitution in the structure of government. That's what Aristotle argues. So structure of government is who rules. Is it the few? Is it the many? Is it the one? Right. And so a tyrannical government is not about the structure of government. It's about what the government is end, right? So if the government, as Aristotle argues, its end is towards the common good or the people, then that's a good form of government. But if it's towards the private interests of the rulers, then that's a tyrannical form of government. So I would argue, I mean, in some ways, yeah, our regime is tyrannical, so there is some justification in overthrowing it. But, so yeah, I would agree to some extent. But I would just say that it's not fully tyrannical. I think there's some good in our regime. And secondly, it's just not, it's the criteria is just not possible. Like, I would support a regime change if it was possible. Like, I would totally support it, but that's my position.
This period now being terminated.
What is a king? Must he be hereditary? Apparently not. Must he be elected? No, but he can be. Wait, so then is Trump a king? What if he just does everything that a king does? He exerts even more power than the feudal lords, than the feudal kings, than Louis IX. Let's say Xi Jinping, the president of the People's Republic of China. Is he a king? We don't know. Is just one person being in charge of a lot, generally speaking, a king? No, I think we would all reasonably say that right now America is not a kingdom. That when two consuls were elected in Rome, they were not an empire. There was not an emperor. They were still a republic. Therefore, when my opponents try to claim that, oh, you have unity, you have one leader, that's good. We agree, one is good. Unity as a metaphysical principle is good. However, when on a practical level, which my opponents have to prove, they have to prove that it's also practical, having a king, having a hereditary king, which is the only example they've given, actually I don't think they've really given any examples, does not work. Holy Roman Empire, 7 electors, not hereditary. Church, not hereditary. Sometimes, a couple times. Venice, not hereditary, but longest republic, very long, over 1,000 years, and the only people to ever conquer Constantinople. Not hereditary, they were a republic. Voting issue 1, tripartite government. Again, tripartite government. I don't think that a monarch should rule everyone. I think there should be a tripartite government. As Aquinas says, quote, for this is the best form of polity, being partly kingdom, since there is one at the head of all. We agree with that, like the President of the United States, like the head of the Republic, like the head of Venice. The Doge of Venice was at the top of the kingdom. It's a term. Just because it's used the word kingdom doesn't mean, just because Xi is called the President of China, we know he isn't the President of China. It's just the term. Partly aristocracy, insofar as the number of persons are set in authority. Partly democracy, i.e. government by the people, insofar as the rulers can be chosen from the people, and the people have the right to choose their rulers, end quote. We want a tripartite system. So point A, Aquinas, well I've already quoted Aquinas. So point B, and that's on a practical level. So I'm not saying that unity is bad, and that what Aquinas said about unity shouldn't be regarded. I agree with it, but we're looking at the practical level. We also see Aquinas say, and he's talking here about, and the same question in 105, he's talking about the Israelites. Quote, such was the form of government established by divine law. For Moses and his successors governed the people in such a way that each of them was ruler over all, so that there was a kind of kingdom. Moreover, 72 men were chosen who were elder in virtue. For it was written, I took out of your tribe wise and honorable and appointed them rulers. So that there was an element of aristocracy. But it was a democratical government insofar as the ruler was chosen from all the people. For it is written, quote, provide out of all the people wise men. And again, insofar as they were chosen by the people, wherefore it is written, let me have from among you wise men. Consequently, it is evident that the ordering of the rulers was well provided for by the law. End quote. That's all from Aquinas. Subpoint B, feudal. Again, feudal. We think the feudal system works well. Crusades succeeded under it. And we got the Crusader kingdoms from it. And we see that feudal systems, let's see. Oh yes, this is according to the Catholic Encyclopedia, which has the Legal Obsta and the Imprimatur. It's from 1912. It says, quote, at any rate, instead of every able-bodied man being individually bound in person to serve the sovereign in the field, the lord and landowners were obliged in virtue of their tenure to furnish, did I lose the page again? No. Oh yes, to furnish certain quantity of fighting men armed with fixed and definite weapons according to the degree, rank, and wealth and combatant. Clearly we see that there is a loyalty to the lord in an aristocracy format, not to the king necessarily. The king is 4 times of a merchant, and that's good.
1 minute.
The sort of Cincinnatus figure. But no one again would say that Cincinnatus was the king. No, he worked in a republic. Rome. Quote, finally, the king himself was pushed up to the apex of the whole system. The various lords commended themselves to this central figure to aid them in times of stress, for they saw the uselessness of trying to singly repel a foe. They were continually being defeated because Shire would not help Shire, Anglo-Saxon Chronicle of 1010. Just because there is one leader among them in certain times and in certain aspects does not mean that it is a kingdom. It's mixed. It's part one the other, part a third. Subpoint C, the greats. We have the English Empire, ruled 25% of the world, 420 million people. We have the Venetian Republic. They drew lots to elect their doge. They were the longest republic, and they outlived many a monarchy. And we have Rome, which had about 600 senators in the time of Augustus Caesar. Voting issue 2 is merit. Merit. If you have a bad son, you cut him off on his merit. We should vote based on merit. If the son is trained by his father to be president, you can elect him. You don't need him to be a monarch. You can elect him. The people can decide if he actually
Point of order.
I think that makes up for
timer.
them going on in the question period.
But you also cut me off when I was doing
Order.
You went on long.
I thank the honorable member of opposition and call upon the Prime Minister to deliver the final speech of the round, not to exceed 5 minutes, reminding him that while new examples are welcome, new arguments are not.
I'd like to thank the opposition. I will try to get through every single one I can, and if not, forgive me. So I need to make clear, the debate is not, although practicality is of course important, and monarchy can be shown to be practical, the debate is not, is monarchy the best able to be implemented in the modern day, but is monarchy the best form of government, which does require an objective reality based on universal truth. We cannot just throw that out entirely. We never argue that monarchy is never corruptible, and this is where I bring up, we never argue that monarchy is never corruptible, but we have shown in specifically past arguments that the corruptibility, the probability of a corruption is lower. And also we talk about nepotism. Nepotism has, in fact, a different connotation. It's not always negative. But moving on from this, it seems that unless I am completely misunderstanding my opponents, they are arguing that we cannot argue for mixed form of government, and that we have to defend specifically pure monarchy. Now first, it must be shown that from the logic of my opponent then, pure monarchy is objectively superior. They have admitted it. One of our opponents specifically mentioned that, yeah, if we could do a regime change into a monarchy, I definitely would. The question is, why would we? Second, nobody would argue in defense of any pure government, as a pure government does not exist. And I have to ask, would we say, because you brought up feudal monarchy, that St. Louis IX is not an actual king because he ruled a mixed feudal form? Would we say that, for example, even Charlemagne was not a true king or an emperor monarch because he also had a mixed form? We would also say, would we say that America is not a democracy because it's a mixed form? We talk about mixed forms of government in line with our metaphysical outcome. All good forms of government, all forms of government that actually exist are mixed forms. But even if I were to concede that, monarchy from a metaphysical aspect is still shown to be the best. Now we mentioned Aristotle, and I'd like to specifically bring up a quote from Aristotle here, that a kingdom is the best of these, a republic is the worst. I'm sorry, I'm trying to find every single place to make sure I address every single point. And we talk about the practicalities of monarchy, we talk about the virtue of the people, etc. and this sort of regime change. I would say this specifically, this is a quote. In a monarchy, one man must be wise. In a democracy, 1,000 men must be wise. Which is more likely? And there is that reality of all forms of government will eventually, because the concupiscence of man, become corrupt and fall apart. However, and I think we can see this in our modern American system, that it is much more probable, much more effective, much more practical for one man to be wise than 1,000. And it was asked, which man today could truly rule morally and justly and effectively? And to that I say, well, Pope Leo the 13th. Sorry, Pope Leo the 14th. And yes, Pope Leo the 14th most definitely, the greatest monarch of the church. Specifically, I'm trying to find this specifically here. It was already agreed and conceded that corruption of the best is the worst. Tyranny, as we all agree here, is the worst form of, or distortion of form of government. And the corruption of best is the worst. And therefore tyranny, because tyranny is a corruption of the monarchy, it is declared that monarchy is the best form. Also, specifically, we talk about the analogy of the family. Now, I hate this to be an intellectual cop-out. All analogies do fall short. But again, I would also argue while all forms of government do, in fact, reflect some form of the human nature, and all governments can, in fact, succeed. I am not arguing that democracy or aristocracy can never be Catholic, never be family, but also that monarchy does it best. Democracy and aristocracy and democracy does not reflect better that form of family. And if we're going to go use historical arguments now, we mentioned that actually fathers do end up letting their children rule instead. If we want to look purely at history, we see this happen in monarchy too. Charles V specifically gave it to his, the empire specifically to his brother, and Spain to his son to live in a monastery. This actually, in fact, happened many times. We've also seen that because, this is actually an interesting argument about tyranny, that a monarch, because all legitimacy flows from him, worst case, if a monarch is evil, he is the biggest target on the back. And this is actually a problem that's been brought up by many modern American political philosophers. We are in a bureaucracy where authority and power is spread around, where we don't know who to put on trial, who to punish specifically for evil. In a monarchy, the target is on one back. This is why when you've had some bad monarchs in history, their sons actually end up doing a lot better. And it is because of that recognition. I'm specifically trying to find if there's anything else left. By the way, Marcellus de Padua, as who was mentioned specifically, was a condemned heretic, specifically argued the church should also be a democracy. And now again, monarchy, we are not saying that you cannot have any form of unity under a democracy or an aristocracy. St. Thomas would not deny that, and he would be
10 seconds.
etc. We are saying that monarchy does it best. Again, if we're looking at the principle of unity, because guess what? Transcendentals aren't just abstract, they apply to practical.
Thank you very much. This House stands resolved. Monarchy is the best form of government. All in favor, raise his hand saying yay.
Yay.
All men against, raise his hand saying nay. Each coward abstaining, raise his hand if he dare.
All right. With 5 votes for government, 7 for opposition, and 1 abstention, the motion has failed. Stand.